They said no one ever goes back into a burning structure twice unless something inside is worth more than fear itself. And on that morning at Fort Reynolds, no one expected it to be a German shepherd who would break that rule without hesitation. The sky over the base was heavy with smoke drifting in slow gray ribbons, not wild enough to be called chaos, but enough to make every breath feel measured and uncertain. Sirens had already softened into distant echoes, replaced by the low hum of emergency crews coordinating across cracked radios. Staff Sergeant Caleb Johnson stood near the edge of the containment zone, boots planted in ash-dusted gravel, his posture steady in the way only years of discipline can carve into a man. His skin was dark and marked by quiet exhaustion, his eyes scanning the structure ahead where heat still shimmered in invisible waves. Around him, Marines moved with controlled urgency, speaking in clipped phrases, checking each other's gear, maintaining order in a moment that refused to be orderly. But Caleb's attention wasn't on the structure alone. It was on the absence he felt beside him. Ghost, his canine partner, a white German shepherd with a coat usually bright like morning frost, had vanished moments earlier without command or hesitation. Caleb had last seen him standing still, ears angled forward, locked on something no one else had noticed. Then, without sound or signal, Ghost had moved, slipping past containment lines as if pulled by something deeper than instruction. Caleb took a step forward, then stopped as a Marine beside him shook his head. "You can't go in there, Sergeant," the man said, voice firm but not unkind, and Caleb didn't answer right away because part of him already knew that rules were built for situations that still made sense, and this one no longer did. A faint memory surfaced then, uninvited but clear, of training days under harsh sun, when Ghost was still young and uncertain, when Caleb had knelt beside him and spoken quietly, not as a handler, but as a partner, saying, "You don't leave me, and I won't leave you." Words spoken half as promise, half as instinct, never imagining they would be tested like this. The structure ahead groaned softly as heat moved through its frame, not collapsing, not stable, existing in that dangerous middle where time feels stretched and uncertain. Caleb's radio crackled with updates he barely processed, coordinates, safety perimeters, procedural confirmations, all of it fading beneath a single thought that refused to leave him alone. Ghost was still inside. No one else seemed willing to acknowledge it yet, or maybe they were trying not to. Then, from somewhere within the haze of smoke and heat shimmer, a sound cut through the distance, faint at first, almost mistaken for shifting debris, but Caleb knew it instantly because some sounds live in memory deeper than hearing, and it was a bark, sharp, controlled, unmistakably deliberate. His head lifted. One of the Marines beside him froze. "That's not possible," someone muttered under their breath, but Caleb was already moving before permission could catch up with instinct. He stepped forward just enough for the heat to press against him, stopping again at the boundary line where visibility broke apart into wavering distortion. Inside, the world was reduced to silhouettes and suggestion, but Ghost was there, somewhere beyond the veil of smoke, and Caleb could feel it the way you feel distance in a room you know too well. The radio called his name once, twice, but it sounded far away, like another life trying to reach him. Then came movement, low and determined, a shape emerging briefly in the shifting haze, white fur dulled by ash but still unmistakable, moving with purpose rather than panic. Ghost was not running blindly. He was carrying something small, secured carefully in his grip, his steps steady despite the unstable ground beneath him. Caleb's breath caught without permission, not in fear, but in recognition of something he couldn't yet name. Around them, the base seemed to hold its breath as well, Marines lowering their voices, attention pulled toward the impossible sight forming at the edge of visibility. Ghost continued forward, each step measured, refusing haste, as if what he carried demanded care more than speed. And in that moment Caleb understood that whatever training had shaped this dog, it had never been about obedience alone, but about judgment, about heart, about something deeper than command. And as Ghost reached the threshold where smoke began to thin, stepping closer to the waiting hands of the men outside, the weight of what he carried became clear not through words or explanation, but through the silence that fell over everyone watching, a silence so complete it felt like the world itself had paused to witness what loyalty looked like when it refused to turn back. Ghost moved through the thinning smoke like a memory refusing to fade, each step measured with a calm that did not belong to chaos, as if he had already accepted something deeper than urgency. The Marines outside the boundary line watched in silence that felt heavier than sound itself, their attention fixed on the white shape emerging from the haze with deliberate care. Staff Sergeant Caleb Johnson stood at the front without realizing he had moved there, his boots now beyond the comfort of protocol, his focus narrowed to the single figure he trusted more than any system or procedure. Ghost's coat was no longer the bright white it had been at dawn, now softened by ash and dust, yet his presence remained unmistakable, steady, purposeful, unbroken. In his mouth he carried a small metal case, not large enough to suggest weight in the physical sense, but held with a precision that made it feel important in a way that had nothing to do with size. Caleb's breath slowed as he recognized the way Ghost did not rush, did not falter, did not glance away from his path, as though every step had been chosen long before the fire ever began. The surrounding Marines shifted slightly, some lowering their gaze in disbelief, others frozen in quiet attention, because there are moments in service when training gives way to something older than training, something instinctive and unspoken. Caleb stepped forward carefully, raising one hand not as command but as reassurance, his voice low when he finally spoke, though it carried no urgency, only recognition. Ghost reached him at the edge of the safe zone and stopped exactly where he needed to stop, as if the line between danger and safety had always been visible to him in a way it was not to others. For a long moment neither moved, human and K9 locked in a silence that felt complete, as Ghost held the small case gently, refusing to release it until Caleb knelt down slowly, bringing himself to the same level. The Marine extended his hand, fingers steady but soft, and only then did Ghost carefully lower the case into his grasp, never breaking eye contact, his amber eyes reflecting something that felt almost like understanding beyond words. Caleb hesitated before opening it, not out of fear, but out of respect for the weight of effort it represented, and when he finally lifted the latch, the world around him seemed to quiet even further. Inside was not destruction or urgency, but something deeply personal, carefully preserved despite everything. A small collection of identification tags and a folded piece of cloth marked with unit insignia, items that spoke of presence rather than absence, of connection rather than loss. Caleb's expression shifted in a way that no order or briefing had ever managed to provoke, his jaw tightening slightly as recognition settled in, not of objects alone, but of what they represented. Around him, the Marines leaned in subtly, not to intrude, but because silence had pulled them all into the same gravity, the same shared stillness. Ghost remained seated, posture unwavering, as if confirming that his mission was complete, yet his eyes never left Caleb's face, watching for something only he could interpret. The wind moved gently through the perimeter, carrying away the last traces of smoke, and with it came a strange clarity, as though the world itself had decided to reveal what had been hidden in urgency. Caleb ran his thumb lightly over the edge of the contents, his breathing uneven but controlled, and for a moment he did not speak, because words would have broken something fragile and important. Instead, he looked at Ghost, really looked at him, not as a trained unit asset, not as a military partner, but as something far closer, something that had chosen to return when returning mattered most. The Marines behind him stood in respectful quiet, some lowering their heads slightly, others simply staring ahead as if afraid to interrupt what they were witnessing. Caleb finally exhaled, a slow release of tension that seemed to have been building far longer than the day itself, and he placed a hand gently on Ghost's head, fingers sinking into ash-touched fur with a careful steadiness. Ghost leaned forward slightly at the touch, not in exhaustion, but in acknowledgement, as though the weight he had carried was never just physical, but something shared between them both. In that moment, the boundary between command and companionship dissolved quietly, leaving only trust, loyalty, and the unspoken truth that some returns are more meaningful than arrivals, and some journeys are measured not in distance, but in what is brought back when everything else has been left behind. The stillness that followed felt heavier than any command that had ever crossed the field, as if the entire base had agreed, without speaking, that nothing needed to move for the moment except the wind passing gently through the perimeter lines. Staff Sergeant Caleb Johnson kept his hand resting on Ghost's head, not as an order, but as an acknowledgement of something that had crossed a threshold no training ever truly prepared a man for. Ghost remained perfectly still beneath his touch, breathing slow and steady, eyes fixed on Caleb with a calm that suggested completion rather than exhaustion, as though the journey through smoke and heat had not been an act of survival alone, but an act of return. Around them, Marines slowly eased their posture, no longer scanning for threat or procedure, their attention shifting toward the small metal case, now resting securely in Caleb's other hand. No one spoke at first because the absence of sound felt more appropriate than anything language could offer, and even the distant sirens had faded into a kind of background memory rather than urgency. Caleb finally lowered his gaze to the case again, his thumb tracing the edge with careful precision, and in that quiet motion there was something deeply human, something stripped of rank and reduced to recognition. A nearby officer stepped closer, voice low and controlled, breaking the silence with caution rather than interruption, explaining softly that the identification tags belonged to a logistics support Marine who had gone unaccounted for during the earlier evacuation wave. Someone whose presence had been confirmed inside the structure moments before conditions forced withdrawal. The words were simple, but their weight was not, and they settled into the air like dust that refused to fall. Caleb did not respond immediately, because his thoughts were not on procedure or report, but on the fact that Ghost had gone back without hesitation, not for mission parameters, not for command, but for something he had sensed as unfinished. Ghost shifted slightly at Caleb's side, pressing his shoulder lightly against the Marine's leg, a gesture so subtle it almost went unnoticed, yet it anchored Caleb more firmly than any spoken reassurance could have. The cloth inside the case, now partially unfolded by Caleb's careful hands, bore the faint markings of unit insignia and personal stitching, small details that suggested it had been kept close to the body of someone who once wore it with pride. A memory surfaced in Caleb's mind, uninvited but vivid, of a conversation weeks earlier during routine training, when the same missing Marine had joked quietly about leaving something behind that would still find its way home if anything ever went wrong, spoken with half a smile that no one had fully understood at the time. Now, standing in the aftermath of silence, that memory carried a different weight, no longer casual but quietly profound. The Marines nearby shifted their attention downward, some adjusting their gloves, others simply staring at the ground, as if giving space for something sacred in its own understated way. Caleb exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that releases more than air, and he pressed his palm gently against Ghost's neck again, feeling the steady pulse beneath the fur, real and present and grounding. Ghost leaned in slightly, not seeking praise, not seeking recognition, but simply remaining close, as though his role in the moment was not to be understood but to be shared. The wind moved again across the open field, carrying with it the faint scent of ash dissipating into clean air, and with that shift the atmosphere softened in a way that felt almost like permission to breathe again. Caleb looked once more at the case, then toward Ghost, and something unspoken passed between them that did not require interpretation, only acceptance. Around them, the Marines resumed small movements, not returning to chaos but to order reshaped by what they had witnessed, their silence now carrying a different tone, less confusion and more reverence. Ghost remained seated, composed and unwavering, as if he understood that the hardest part of any mission was not the moment of action, but the moment after, when meaning began to settle into place. Caleb finally lifted his gaze toward the horizon where smoke had fully begun to thin, and in that widening space of clarity he felt something quiet but undeniable take root, a recognition that what had been brought back was never just physical, but something far more lasting, something that lived in loyalty, memory, and the kind of trust that does not ask to be understood in order to be real. The air around the perimeter had begun to change in a way that was almost imperceptible at first, as if the base itself was slowly remembering how to breathe again after holding its breath through the unknown. Staff Sergeant Caleb Johnson remained in the same position for several seconds longer than necessary, his hand still resting on Ghost's neck, feeling the steady rhythm beneath the ash-dusted fur like a grounding point in a world that had briefly lost its center. Ghost did not move away. He simply stayed close, eyes calm, posture relaxed but alert, as though the mission he had chosen to complete had settled into something quieter now, something that no longer required motion. Around them, Marines resumed small adjustments, checking gear straps, speaking in low voices, but the urgency that had defined earlier moments had softened into something more reflective, something almost reverent. Caleb finally lifted his hand slowly, not because he wanted distance, but because he recognized completion when it stood in front of him. The small metal case remained open in his other hand, its contents no longer just objects but symbols of presence that had survived what the eye could not fully comprehend. A senior officer approached carefully, stopping a few feet away, his voice measured as he confirmed the identity verification process was underway, explaining that what had been recovered matched records of a marine logistics specialist last seen assisting evacuation coordination before communications were lost in the confusion of the earlier emergency. The words were procedural, but they landed differently now, as if facts and emotion were no longer separate things within this space. Caleb listened without interrupting, his eyes shifting between the case and Ghost, as though trying to reconcile what logic could explain and what instinct had already accepted. Ghost turned his head slightly toward Caleb, not seeking instruction, but attention, and in that small motion there was a quiet reminder that nothing about his return had been accidental in feeling, even if it defied explanation in form. The wind passed gently across the open field again, carrying away the last traces of lingering smoke, revealing a clearer horizon where the sky began to reopen in soft gradients of blue and gray. Caleb closed the case carefully, his fingers steady, and for a moment he simply held it against his palm as if acknowledging not only what had been brought back, but what it represented. Around them, the Marines stood in varied silence, some with heads slightly lowered, others watching the horizon, all of them shaped by the same shared recognition that something meaningful had occurred beyond the scope of routine duty. One of them spoke quietly, almost to himself, about how Ghost had moved without hesitation, how he had chosen direction where uncertainty had existed, but his words trailed off because there was no need to define what everyone had already understood in their own way. Caleb finally turned fully toward Ghost, crouching slightly to meet him at eye level, his expression no longer carrying the weight of command, but something softer, something closer to gratitude than authority. Ghost held his gaze without wavering, amber eyes steady and clear, reflecting not exhaustion, but presence, as if he had always been exactly where he was meant to be. Caleb placed both hands gently along Ghost's shoulders, grounding himself in the reality of that moment. And in doing so, he felt something settle within him that had been unsettled since the first alarm had sounded earlier that morning. The base behind them continued to function, personnel moving, communications resuming, procedures returning to shape. Yet within this small circle of stillness, there was a different kind of order forming, one not written in manuals, but understood in silence. Caleb exhaled slowly, a breath that seemed to release more than tension, and for the first time since the incident began, his posture eased without losing strength. Ghost leaned forward slightly, closing the space between them, as if confirming that no distance had ever truly existed where trust was concerned. The moment held without demand, without urgency, existing simply as it was, and in that quiet space both man and K9 remained grounded not by rank or role, but by something far more enduring that neither needed to name to understand. The quiet that followed no longer felt like suspension between moments, but like something settling into place, as if the world had accepted a truth it could not fully explain yet. Staff Sergeant Caleb Johnson stood beside Ghost in the open field near the perimeter, his posture no longer rigid with operational urgency, but softened into something closer to reflection. The small metal case had been passed into secure hands for documentation, yet its absence from Caleb's grasp did not diminish its presence in his mind. Around them, the base had resumed its natural rhythm, Marines moving between tasks, vehicles rolling at a controlled pace, radios speaking in calm coordination, but everything felt slightly altered, as if the air itself had learned something it would not forget. Ghost remained seated at Caleb's side, his white coat catching the shifting light as the smoke above continued to dissolve into a clearer sky. There was no sign of agitation, no lingering stress, only a steady composure that felt deliberate, as though the weight he had carried had not broken him but defined him in silence. Caleb finally exhaled fully, the kind of breath that arrives only after the mind stops resisting what the heart already understands. A senior Marine approached again, this time without urgency, holding a tablet with confirmation notes and identity validation records. His voice respectful as he explained that the recovered items had been officially linked to the missing logistics Marine, and that notification procedures for next of kin would begin according to protocol. The words were careful, structured, necessary, but they carried a different tone now, because everyone speaking them had witnessed something that no report could fully contain. Caleb nodded once, acknowledging the process, yet his attention drifted briefly to Ghost, who had turned his head slightly toward the horizon as if listening to something beyond sound. The wind had shifted again, this time warmer, carrying with it the faint clarity of a sky returning to openness after tension. Caleb knelt slowly beside Ghost, not out of procedure or command, but out of instinct, and placed a hand gently along the dog's shoulder, feeling the steady strength beneath the surface. Ghost leaned into the touch without hesitation, as if it had always been part of the same language they had shared without words since the beginning. Around them, movement continued, but at a respectful distance, as if the space they occupied had become temporarily separate from the rest of operations, not in isolation, but in significance. Caleb looked forward toward the cleared horizon where the structure once stood, now reduced to quiet aftermath and drifting air, and in that view he found no confusion left, only a measured understanding that some actions are not defined by instruction, but by connection that predates instruction itself. Ghost rose slowly to his feet, stretching once, then standing beside Caleb again, aligned naturally as though no separation had ever occurred. The Marines nearby resumed their work fully now, voices returning to normal cadence, equipment checked, reports finalized, yet subtle glances still turned toward the pair at the field's edge, because what they had witnessed had already been absorbed into memory. Caleb adjusted his stance, steadying himself, and gave a small nod that carried more meaning than any formal acknowledgement could express. Ghost responded by stepping half a pace closer, matching him without command, without hesitation, simply existing in sync with the man beside him. The sky above them opened further, revealing clean light spreading across the base, and in that widening space Caleb felt something quiet but permanent settle into place, not as conclusion, but as understanding that would remain long after the moment itself had passed. The morning had fully shifted now, not into urgency or chaos, but into a calm aftermath that carried a different kind of weight, the kind that settles quietly into memory rather than action. Staff Sergeant Caleb Johnson remained on the open field near the perimeter of Fort Reynolds, his stance relaxed but attentive, as if his body had not yet fully accepted that the moment of crisis had passed into something else entirely. Ghost stood beside him, no longer marked by the ash-dulled traces of earlier movement, his white coat gradually returning to its natural brightness under the widening daylight. The base continued its steady rhythm around them, vehicles passing in measured intervals, voices carrying through radios with routine updates, yet everything felt subtly altered, as if a shared understanding had passed silently through the entire operation without needing to be spoken aloud. Caleb's hand rested loosely at his side now, no longer anchored to procedure or command, but still aware of Ghost's presence in a way that felt more personal than professional. A few steps away, a logistics officer finalized written documentation, confirming identity verification and chain of custody procedures with quiet precision, his voice calm as he explained that notifications were already being prepared for the family of the missing Marine. The words were administrative, yet they carried emotional gravity that no one attempted to soften, because there are moments when clarity itself becomes the only respectful form of communication. Caleb listened without interruption, his eyes occasionally shifting toward Ghost, who remained still but alert, his gaze moving between Caleb and the horizon as if tracking something beyond immediate perception. The wind had grown lighter, carrying with it a clean stillness that replaced the earlier haze, and the sky above the base opened further into a clear expanse that felt almost unfamiliar after the density of earlier hours. Caleb exhaled slowly, not in relief alone, but in recognition that something irreversible had taken place within him, something that had altered the way he would remember this day, even years from now. Ghost suddenly shifted his weight slightly, stepping half a pace forward before pausing again, his ears lifting as distant sounds of routine operations filtered through the air, yet his focus remained steady and composed, as though he had already returned fully to the present. Caleb followed his movement with quiet attention, then knelt once more beside him, not because he needed to, but because the space between them no longer felt defined by rank or responsibility. His hand came to rest again along Ghost's shoulder, fingers pressing gently into the familiar texture of fur and muscle, grounding himself in something real and immediate. Ghost responded with subtle stillness, not leaning forward this time, but simply remaining aligned, as if acknowledging that the connection between them required no further confirmation. Around them, Marines continued their tasks, though some still cast brief glances toward the pair, not out of curiosity alone, but out of a lingering awareness that what they had witnessed earlier had left an imprint that would not fade easily. Caleb looked out across the field, where the remnants of earlier disturbance had fully given way to order restored, and in that quiet horizon he found no unanswered questions, only a deeper acceptance of what had unfolded. Ghost rose again, matching Caleb's movement as he stood, their steps naturally aligning as they began to walk slowly along the perimeter path, not directed by urgency or instruction, but by a shared rhythm that required no coordination beyond trust. The base stretched outward around them, alive with motion and function, yet, within this narrow space between man and K9, there existed a calm that felt separate from everything else, not isolated, but complete. Caleb's expression remained steady, but softer now, as if something within him had been realigned by what could not be measured or documented. Ghost walked beside him without deviation, eyes forward, posture calm, embodying a quiet certainty that did not need validation. The sunlight above them continued to strengthen, casting long, clean lines across the ground, and in that expanding brightness Caleb felt a final settling within himself, not as an ending, but as the quiet understanding that some moments do not conclude, they simply remain. The afternoon light had settled into a calmer tone now, stretching long and soft across the open fields of Fort Reynolds, where the earlier tension had fully dissolved into the ordinary rhythm of a military base returning to its normal state. Staff Sergeant Caleb Johnson walked slowly along the perimeter path, his pace unhurried, as if he had no desire to separate himself from the quiet that now surrounded him. Ghost moved beside him with the same steady coordination as before, no leash, no command necessary, only an unspoken understanding that had become more natural than any formal instruction they had ever received. The base continued its operations in the background, vehicles passing at measured intervals, distant voices exchanging routine updates, but none of it disturbed the space between them. Caleb's eyes remained forward, yet his awareness stayed anchored to the presence at his side, as though every step Ghost took was also a reminder of something he had come to recognize more clearly with each passing hour. A logistics officer had already finalized the reports related to the earlier incident, and the documentation process had transitioned into standard closure procedures. Yet even that administrative normality carried a subtle weight, because everyone involved understood that what had occurred earlier did not belong entirely within the language of procedure. Caleb paused briefly near a fence line overlooking a stretch of open training ground, where the grass moved gently under a shifting breeze, and Ghost stopped with him, matching the stillness without hesitation. There was no urgency in their posture now, only continuity, as if movement itself had become secondary to presence. Caleb lowered his gaze slightly, his hand resting near his side, and for a moment he thought about how silence could feel different depending on what had preceded it. This silence was not empty nor unresolved, but full in a way that required no explanation. Ghost shifted his weight subtly, his attention moving toward the horizon where the sky had fully cleared, revealing a wide expanse of pale blue stretching beyond the base boundaries. Caleb followed that gaze, and in doing so found himself reflecting not on what had been recovered earlier, but on what had been understood without words. A senior officer approached at a respectful distance, offering a brief update that all procedures had been completed and that formal acknowledgement would be issued to all personnel involved, his tone professional, yet softened by the awareness that no report could fully contain the meaning of the events that had taken place. Caleb nodded once in acknowledgement, though his attention remained divided between the conversation and the presence beside him. When the officer departed, the space returned to quiet again, and Caleb allowed himself to breathe more fully, no longer carrying the pressure of immediate response. Ghost remained still, yet alert, his posture unchanged, as though he understood that the absence of urgency did not mean the absence of purpose. Caleb finally stepped forward again, continuing along the path, and Ghost moved with him seamlessly, maintaining the same measured pace as if no transition had ever occurred. The sunlight overhead had grown warmer, casting soft highlights across the field, and the shadows beneath them lengthened gently without tension. Caleb thought briefly of the earlier moment when everything had felt suspended, when decisions had not been guided by instruction, but by something deeper and more instinctive, and he realized that what remained now was not the memory of action, but the understanding of connection. Ghost glanced up briefly at Caleb as they walked, then returned his gaze forward, calm and composed, as though confirming that nothing more needed to be proven between them. In that simple exchange there was no hierarchy, no assignment, only shared presence shaped by experience that neither of them needed to articulate. The perimeter fence continued alongside them, marking the boundary of the base, yet it no longer felt like a division between spaces, only a line passing through a larger continuity of movement and stillness. Caleb's expression remained steady, but something within it had softened into acceptance, not of outcome alone, but of meaning that had revealed itself gradually through silence and action combined. Ghost's steps remained even, unbroken, each one aligned with Caleb's without effort, as if the rhythm of their movement had become a language in itself. The wind moved gently across the open field once more, carrying with it a sense of completion that did not demand recognition, only acknowledgement in the quiet way that some truths exist beyond explanation. And as they continued forward together, the distance between duty and understanding felt smaller than it had ever been, not because anything had changed around them, but because something within that space had finally been understood. The light over Fort Reynolds had begun to shift again, softening into the warm tones of late afternoon as the base slowly returned to its full operational rhythm. Yet something subtle remained different in the way the world felt, as if time itself had slightly adjusted its pace after what had taken place earlier. Staff Sergeant Caleb Johnson continued walking along the perimeter path with Ghost beside him, their movement steady and unbroken, no longer shaped by urgency, but by a quiet continuity that felt almost natural, as if they had always moved this way together. The fence line stretched beside them, not as a boundary of separation, but as a guide tracing the edge of open land beneath a sky that had fully cleared of smoke and tension. Caleb's hands were relaxed now, no longer anchored in readiness, yet his awareness of Ghost remained constant, not in vigilance, but in recognition, though every step carried a reminder of something that had settled deeply into understanding rather than thought. Ghost walked with the same composed rhythm, his white coat reflecting the fading sunlight in soft highlights, his posture calm and aligned, his presence no longer marked by action, but by something closer to stillness and motion. A distant formation of Marines could be seen near the training yard, preparing for routine evening procedures, their voices faint and measured, blending into the natural sound of the base without urgency or disruption. Caleb glanced in their direction briefly, then returned his gaze forward, feeling the weight of the day not as burden, but as memory forming into clarity. There had been reports finalized, acknowledgments processed, and formal confirmations delivered regarding the earlier incident, yet none of it felt sufficient to define what had truly occurred, because what remained could not be fully contained within documentation or procedure. It lived instead in the quiet space between actions, in the unspoken recognition shared by those who had witnessed something that did not require explanation to be understood. Ghost slowed slightly as they reached a gentle incline along the perimeter, and Caleb matched his pace without thought, their synchronization effortless, as though movement itself had become a shared language that needed no instruction. The wind passed lightly across the field, carrying with it the final traces of warmth from the day, and Caleb found himself noticing details he might have otherwise overlooked: the sound of distant boots on gravel, the faint hum of equipment shutting down for the evening, the way light touched the ground in long, uninterrupted lines. None of it felt ordinary, yet none of it felt extraordinary either, only present, grounded, and real. Ghost paused for a moment at the top of the incline, looking out across the open expanse beyond the base, and Caleb stopped beside him, following his gaze. For a few seconds neither moved, as if both were observing the same horizon from different perspectives that had quietly converged. Caleb thought of the small metal case that had been recovered earlier, now secured within formal custody, and he understood that its meaning was never about the object itself, but about the path it had taken to return. Ghost turned his head slightly toward Caleb, then back toward the horizon, and in that subtle motion there was no request, no command, only presence. Caleb lowered himself to rest briefly on the edge of the path, allowing the moment to exist without interruption, and Ghost remained standing beside him, close enough that the space between them felt unnecessary to define. Around them, the base continued its steady rhythm, vehicles moving at regulated intervals, lights beginning to activate across distant structures as evening approached, yet within their immediate space there was a calm that felt uninterrupted by external motion. Caleb finally spoke quietly, not as an instruction, but as acknowledgement, his voice low and steady as he reflected that some moments do not resolve in the way events typically conclude, but instead remain as understanding that continues forward without needing to be revisited. Ghost listened without shifting, his posture unchanged, as if he had always understood that already. The sky above them had shifted into deeper shades of gold and pale blue, the transition of day nearing completion, and Caleb stood again, adjusting his stance with slow ease. Ghost moved with him immediately, their alignment returning naturally, step for step, without hesitation or distance. As they began walking once more along the perimeter, the base stretched outward in every direction, functioning, active, alive with routine purpose. Yet within the quiet space they shared there was something that no longer required interpretation. It simply was. Caleb's expression remained calm, but within it there was a settled clarity, not born from explanation, but from experience that had moved beyond words. Ghost walked beside him until the path curved gently forward, both of them continuing into the widening light of evening, where the boundary between silence and understanding no longer felt separate, but part of the same enduring presence that would remain long after the day itself had passed. The evening had fully settled over Fort Reynolds, bringing with it a calm that felt complete, as if the entire base had exhaled together after a long period of unspoken tension. The sky stretched wide in gradients of deep orange and soft blue, fading slowly into the quiet darkness that comes at the end of an operational day, when movement slows but awareness remains. Staff Sergeant Caleb Johnson walked along the final stretch of the perimeter path, his steps unhurried, no longer shaped by urgency or protocol, but by a steady rhythm that felt natural to both body and mind. Ghost remained beside him, close enough that their movement felt like a single continuous presence rather than two separate figures, their alignment unchanged even as the path curved gently toward the main training field. Around them, the base had transitioned into evening procedures, distant lights beginning to illuminate structures and pathways, while voices softened into routine coordination that no longer carried tension. Caleb's gaze remained forward, but his awareness was not limited to what lay ahead. It was grounded in what had already passed through the day and remained present in memory without demand for explanation. Ghost's coat reflected the last remaining light of the sun, now low on the horizon, his posture calm and steady, his movements precise yet unforced, as if every step existed in full understanding of the space they occupied. Caleb finally slowed as they reached an open section of the field, where the ground flattened and the view extended outward toward the distant boundary of the base. Ghost stopped with him immediately, mirroring the pause without hesitation, and together they stood in silence that no longer felt uncertain, but complete. In that stillness, Caleb noticed the smallest details more clearly than before. The faint rustle of wind passing through dry grass, the distant hum of generators powering evening operations, the subtle shift of temperature as day surrendered fully to night. None of it felt dramatic, yet all of it felt present in a way that required attention rather than reaction. Caleb adjusted his stance slightly, placing his hands at his sides, and for a moment allowed himself to simply exist within the quiet without attempting to define it. Ghost turned his head slightly toward him, then forward again, as if acknowledging that no further movement was necessary to confirm what already was understood between them. A passing group of Marines could be seen in the distance, their silhouettes moving in coordinated rhythm toward their assigned quarters, their presence reinforcing the continuity of base life that persisted beyond any single event. Caleb watched them briefly, then returned his attention to the open field ahead, where the last trace of sunlight faded completely beyond the horizon line. The transition into evening felt gradual and uninterrupted, as though the world itself was easing into a state of rest without losing awareness. Ghost shifted his weight once, then settled again, maintaining position beside Caleb without strain or expectation. Caleb lowered his gaze slightly, not in reflection alone, but in recognition of how the day had unfolded into something that no longer required interpretation to be meaningful. There had been action, there had been recovery, there had been procedures completed and reports finalized, yet none of those elements defined the lasting impression that remained within him. What remained instead was the understanding that connection, once formed in moments of uncertainty, does not diminish when the moment passes. Ghost took a single step forward, then paused again, aligning perfectly with Caleb, as if confirming that movement itself was now secondary to presence. Caleb responded by stepping forward as well, and together they resumed walking slowly along the edge of the field, where the boundary fence stretched into the growing darkness, not as separation but as continuity. The sky above them deepened into night, stars beginning to emerge faintly across the open expanse, and the base lights below formed a quiet constellation of their own, steady and constant. Caleb's expression remained composed, but within it there was a settled awareness that no further answers were needed for what had already been understood. Ghost walked beside him without deviation, his presence calm, unwavering, aligned. Not by command, but by shared experience that required no articulation. As they continued forward into the lengthening evening, the space between them felt neither large nor small, only consistent, as if it had always existed in this form. And in that steady movement through fading light, there was no conclusion that needed to be spoken, only a quiet continuation that would remain long after the night fully arrived.